Hello, everyone. My name is Anna Fisher. Welcome. Today, I'd like to talk about something that I think is very topical, which is to say, an infectious disease, since we are all living in these isolation COVID times. The specific disease that I want to talk about is bubonic plague. And yes, specifically bubonic plague, as opposed to any of the other forms of contagious deadly disease caused by the pathogen Y. pestis. Because I want to talk about specifically the outbreak of plague in the 14th century, in the middle of the 14th century, that is known by the name the Black Death, and was known in its own time as the Great Mortality. And within this, I'm sure, very narrow topic, not like that has had the preponderant, a huge amount of historical research and books and shows and everything written about it. I want to talk about an actually narrow topic, which is the myth that has a lot of popularity within my own ethno-religious community, which is to say the Jews. And this is the myth that Jewish people died at lower rates of the plague than their Christian neighbors because of their standards of ritual purity and cleanliness and hygiene. This is, as I said, a myth. It is completely without factual basis. The idea in the first place that Jewish people died at lower rates of the plague compared to their Christian neighbors comes from Christians who claimed that Jewish people were dying at lower rates of the plague, and that this was evidence that they were those vile, evil, pernicious Jews were in fact poisoning wells, and that this is what was causing plague. And of course, the Jews weren't poisoning their own wells, so they weren't getting plague in nearly as high numbers. I think it should go without saying that we should not listen to anti-Semites who think that Jews are poisoning wells as to what's actually going on with the Jews. I think that should be, might possibly be a bad idea. But anyway, we also had Christians at the time who were claiming that the Jews were dying of higher rates of plague because they were cursed by a Christian God, and we should kill all of them because if we did, God would reward us good Christians who murdered all the Jews with an end of the plague. Yeah, I don't believe them either. We also had quite a few Christians, especially among the upper echelons of the church and some of the nobility, who were trying to convince their underlings to, not murder the Jews who were useful to have around. And they put out the claim that the Jewish people were dying at exactly the same rate as Christians, and that this should be taken as evidence that this had nothing to do with Jews or Christians or anything of the kind, and killing all the Jews would not fix anyone's problems. Now, I agree with them, but I think it is important to note that all three of these groups had very, very obvious agendas, and that none of them can be taken as objective sources or at face value. However, the current historical consensus is that Jewish people probably died at roughly similar rates of the plague as their Gentile neighbors did, which makes sense because actually those ritual standards of cleanliness would have done absolutely zero to effectively guard against the plague. First of all, hand washing and bathing, which are the two of the ones that are usually brought up as potential reasons why Jewish people died at lower rates, do absolutely nothing. I mean, nothing against a flea-borne disease like bubonic plague. Potentially, they could actually help with pneumonic plague, which is, after all, a droplet-borne disease. And we all know that hand washing does wonderful things for droplet-borne diseases. In fact, please, everyone, wash your hands to protect yourself from the droplet-borne disease COVID. Please wash your hands. But it doesn't do much to protect you from a flea-borne disease, sadly. So the other trait that is often brought up to say that the other particular trait of Jewish cleanliness standards that is often brought up is the fact that Jewish people wash and then bury their dead very quickly. It should be done within 24 hours according to Jewish ritual law. And this doesn't do anything to protect you from plague either. Because as a body cools, the fleas that are on this person's body, as a plague victim's body cools, the fleas that are starving because Y. pestis actually blocks off their gut and prevents them from actually absorbing the blood meals that they desperately need to survive, they will do everything they can to rapidly jump to the next warm thing they run across, which would, of course, be the people washing the dead, washing and stripping the dead. And yes, actually, this would happen within the first 24 hours. First of all, most of those fleas would be in the victim's clothing. So as people laundered and wore those clothing, some of those fleas would jump out onto them, regardless of when they buried the dead. And then second of all, if they were stripping that body very soon after death, then the fleas would be jumping onto the people doing that. So Christians who wait a while before burying their dead and waited a while at the time might have actually fared a little better under those circumstances. Probably not much better, though. After all, they did die in pretty substantial numbers themselves. Aside from the actual behavior of the plague, we also know that these particular ritual standards of cleanness and purity had absolutely nothing to do with mortality rates, because there was another community with virtually identical standards of ritual virtually identical standards of ritual cleanliness and purity, who in fact died at very, very high rates. And this group had the added advantage of living in large communities and, in fact, nations where everyone would have had those same standards of ritual purity. And so there would have been a much, much larger pool of people who would have been pulling together as a community to engage in these particular practices, which, as we all know, it's not about what an individual does. It's much more about a community coming together to observe the appropriate rules of behavior to protect against diseases, as we all have current experience with, unfortunately. And this community, this group, were, of course, so ultimately those standards of purity would have the best chance in those circumstances to actually protect the community if they were at all protective. And that community, of course, were Muslims. The plague didn't just hit Europe, it also hit the Middle East. And it was actually completely devastating. It was horrible, and many, 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 many people died. So obviously, if it didn't protect Muslims, then those same standards of ritual purity would not protect Jews. So we can put this particular myth to bed. It has no basis in historical reality. Before I leave, I want to say that Christian Europe really didn't become a place where bathing was looked on with suspicion until the early modern period. So actually before that, there was a very strong tradition of public baths that actually goes back to the Roman Empire. If you were always saying to yourself, why did they stop bathing when the Roman Empire fell? Well, they didn't. They didn't. So at the time, Christians bathed and Jews died of the plague. And Christians died of the plague too, obviously. I don't want to diminish that. And if you're Jewish and you really enjoyed this particular myth and you're sad to see it busted because you enjoyed that smug sense of satisfaction, I'm really sorry. I wish it were true. I would love that same smug sense of satisfaction. I get it. And anyway, I am, if you made it all the way to the end of this video, I am so glad that you are here, and